6-0. That's how the second set ended for Alex Eala on Sunday in Toronto. Not a close loss, 6 straight games taken away from her in a row, and just like that, the best stretch of her career came to a stop. Eala played 7 matches across 2 different tournaments, in 2 different cities, on hard courts, with almost 0 real recovery time in between. She won a WTA 500 title in Washington on a Monday, flew to Toronto, and kept winning, match after match, with barely a day off anywhere in that stretch. That kind of schedule doesn't just tire you out, it eventually forces a shutdown, and on Sunday against Belinda Bencic, that shutdown happened live, in the middle of a match, the form of 6 games disappearing in a row. Now let's actually unpack how we got there. Go back to Washington, the Mubadala DC Open Final. Eala went down a set to world number 3 Jessica Pegula, then fought back and closed the match by winning 9 straight games, taking the third set 6-0. That's an incredible win. It's also an enormous physical withdrawal from the tank, the kind of comeback that takes everything out of a player's legs and nervous system. Most athletes would want a week to recover from a final like that. Eala got about 48 hours before she was back on court in Toronto. Her first opponent there was Alicia Parks, the one player on tour who already had a psychological edge over her after bageling her at the Australian Open back in January. Eala won that one too, in 3 sets, solving a matchup that had beaten her before. Another 3-set battle. Another physical toll on top of a tank that was already close to empty from Washington. Then came the third round against Coco Gauff, a Grand Slam champion, someone who doesn't hand over free points, someone who has beaten the best players in the world on the biggest stages tennis has to offer. This wasn't a soft draw. This wasn't a name Eala could ease past on reputation alone. Gauff arrived in Toronto as one of the most dangerous returners on tour, a player whose game is built on relentless movement, deep defensive retrieval, and the kind of pressure that eventually breaks opponents down point by point, game by game, until cracks start to show. On paper, this was supposed to be the match where the run finally hit its ceiling. Instead, Eala took the first set. Think about what that actually required. Not just talent, not just a good day, but the physical ability to match Gauff's movement, to extend rallies against one of the best defenders in the sport, to stay composed against a player who has played on Grand Slam final stages and knows exactly how to apply pressure when an opponent shows the smallest sign of fatigue. Eala didn't just survive that first set, she won it against a former US Open champion in a tournament where she was already several matches deep into an exhausting stretch. That's not a lucky bounce or a favorable matchup. That's a player still finding a way to compete at the highest gear available to her, even as the toll of everything before it was quietly building underneath the surface. Then, partway through the second set, Gauff retired. On paper, this reads as a win by retirement, the kind of result that sometimes gets an asterisk next to it in casual conversation, as if it doesn't count the same way a straight set's victory does. But that read misses the point entirely. Eala's legs still had to produce a full, high-level first set against elite competition to even get to that moment. She still had to move, sprint, change direction, and defend at a level that would have exhausted a fully rested player, let alone one already carrying the accumulated weight of a title run and a revenge win in the days before. Whatever was happening physically on Gauff's side of the net, it doesn't erase what Eala's body had already been asked to do just to get through that first set. The scoreline says retirement. The performance says something entirely different. That's 7 matches now, back-to-back, across a stretch of less than 2 weeks, against a lineup that reads like a murderer's row of women's tennis. A top 3 player in Jessica Pegula closed out with a comeback that demanded everything her legs had left. A dangerous power hitter in Alicia Parks, a player with a psychological edge from an earlier bagel set, requiring a 3-set battle to finally solve. And now a Grand Slam champion in Coco Gauff, someone whose game is specifically designed to punish any hint of fatigue in an opponent's movement. 7 wins, 2 tournaments, 2 different cities. One relentless stretch with almost no real days off in between, and every single one of those matches asking something specific and expensive of a 21-year-old's body. Explosive first steps, repeated sprints, sudden decelerations, the kind of physical demands that hard courts are uniquely brutal about extracting from a player's legs over time. By the time Bencic walked onto the court on Sunday, Eala's body had already cashed almost every check it had. There's a specific kind of exhaustion that doesn't show up as a dramatic collapse right away. It shows up first as a slight delay, a step that arrives half a beat late, a shot that lands a foot shorter than it would have a week earlier. The first set against Bencic still reflected the version of Eala who had carried this entire run. It was close, 6-4, the kind of score that could go either way and still looks like fully competitive tennis on paper. Nothing about that first set screamed collapse. It looked, for all intents and purposes, like a continuation of the same player who had just beaten a top 3 seed, solved a bad matchup, and took a set off a Grand Slam champion. But the second set is where the debt finally came due, all at once, with no warning shot fired beforehand. 6 games gone in a row. No answer on serve, no answer on the return. No sudden tactical adjustment from Bencic that explains a swing that dramatic, because tactics alone rarely produce a 6-game collapse against a player who had just been competitive for an entire first set. What explains it instead is simpler and far less complicated than any strategic breakdown. There was nowhere left to find another gear, because there simply wasn't another gear left to find. The tank wasn't low, it was empty. And when the tank goes fully empty in the middle of a match, it doesn't happen gradually over the course of several games. It happens suddenly, all at once, in exactly the kind of 6-game stretch that Eala experienced on Sunday. That's what makes this specific loss different from a normal loss to a good player on a good day. Bencic didn't suddenly discover a flawless, unbeatable version of her game out of nowhere in that second set. There was no dramatic tactical shift, no sudden discovery of a weakness that had been hiding in plain sight the entire match. No moment where she found some higher gear that simply wasn't available to her in the first set. She's a talented, experienced player, someone who has been at the top level of this sport for years and knows how to compete when a match is close. But nothing about her level jumped dramatically between the first set and the second. If you watched only the shot making, the shot selection, the patterns Bencic was running, you wouldn't see a player transformed. You'd see largely the same player doing largely the same things she'd been doing for the entire match. What changed wasn't Bencic's game. What changed was Eala's ability to keep responding to it. That distinction matters more than it might seem at first glance, because it changes the entire way this result should be read. A loss where your opponent suddenly plays out of her mind is a loss about them. A loss where your own responses simply stop arriving in time, where the legs that were getting to balls in the first set can't quite get there in the second, where the split-second decisions that were sharp an hour earlier start arriving a beat late. That's a loss about you, specifically about what your body has left to give in that exact moment. That's what it looks like when a 21-year-old's body runs out of everything it had left, all at once, mid-match, after asking it to produce elite-level tennis 7 times in under 2 weeks, with almost no true recovery in between. It doesn't look like weakness. It looks like a very specific and very predictable kind of physical limit finally being reached after an extraordinary amount of accumulated stress. Here's why this loss doesn't actually undercut the story of her run. It completes it. There's a real difference between a story ending and a story finishing exactly where it needed to finish in order to make complete sense. An ending that comes out of nowhere, an inexplicable collapse against a clearly inferior opponent. That kind of result raises real questions about whether the run itself was ever as solid as it looked. But this isn't that. This is a story that builds logically, piece by piece, match by match, toward exactly the kind of conclusion that makes sense once you understand everything that came before it. Nobody remembers the exact score of the match that ends a winning streak. Ask any tennis fan a few months from now about the specific number on the scoreboard the day a great run finally stopped, and most won't recall it precisely, because it simply isn't the part of the story that sticks. Scores fade, details blur. What people remember, what actually sticks in the collective memory of a sport and shapes how a player's breakthrough gets talked about for years afterward, is what the streak itself was built on in the first place. And this one was built on something remarkable. It was built on beating a top 3 player in a comeback final, coming from behind against one of the best players in the world, and closing it out with 9 straight games. It was built on solving a matchup that had beaten her before, against a dangerous power hitter, taking a loss from earlier in the season and turning it into a lesson rather than a lingering mental block. It was built on taking a full set off a Grand Slam champion, someone with the pedigree and the big match experience to make that kind of result meaningful, no matter how the full match eventually ended. And all of that happened inside 2 weeks, on a surface she was still adjusting to after an entire grass season built around a completely different style of movement, footwork, and shot-making. Grass rewards low, quick, aggressive tennis. Hard courts ask for something different, longer rallies, more explosive changes of direction, a different rhythm entirely. Making that adjustment mid-season, while also playing 7 matches in under 2 weeks, while also carrying the psychological weight of a first career title, is an enormous amount to ask of any player, let alone one still this early in her career. A body doesn't produce that level of output for free. There's always a cost somewhere, even when everything looks seamless on the outside, even when the wins keep piling up, and the story keeps writing itself in exactly the direction everyone wants it to go. Elite sport has a way of collecting that cost eventually, and it usually collects it at the worst possible moment, right when a player has the least amount of reserve left to actually pay it. That's not a coincidence, and it's not bad luck either. It's simply how physical debt works in any sport that demands this much from the body over a short period of time. Sunday was the bill arriving. It wasn't a verdict on whether Eala belongs at this level, and it certainly wasn't evidence that the run itself was somehow less real or less impressive because of how it ended. If anything, the way it ended actually strengthens the case for how impressive the run really was. A clean physical shutdown, rather than a tactical dismantling where a smarter, better opponent simply figured her out, tells you clearly that this wasn't a skill gap being exposed. It confirms just how much she had been carrying for 2 straight weeks without ever fully addressing it, without ever getting the kind of recovery time that would normally be built into a schedule like this. So what actually matters now isn't the loss itself. Losses happen to every player, even the greatest ones, even the ones who go on to have decades-long careers at the very top of the sport, filled with Grand Slam titles and years at the top of the rankings. A loss, even one that looks as lopsided as a 6-0 second set, doesn't define a career or even define a single tournament run on its own. What matters is what happens in the days and weeks that follow this one specific loss, because that's genuinely where the real story either continues in the direction everyone hopes it will, or takes a turn that becomes genuinely concerning. This is the fork in the road that actually determines how this month gets remembered a year from now. If her team gives her real recovery time before the next tournament, actual rest, not just a single day squeezed in between flights and press obligations, but real, structured physical recovery deliberately built into the schedule, this becomes one line in a much bigger, historic month. It becomes the moment where a young player pushed as far as her body would physically let her, found out in real time exactly where that limit sits, and adjusted accordingly, heading into the next stretch of the season, with that knowledge now in hand. That's not a concerning outcome at all. That's a normal, almost expected part of a breakout period for any athlete pushing into genuinely new territory for the first time in their career. Every great player who has ever had a signature breakthrough stretch has, at some point, run directly into the edge of what their body could handle, and how they respond to finding that edge often says more about their long-term trajectory than the breakthrough itself ever could. If, on the other hand, the fatigue lingers into her next event, if the same signs show up again, a competitive first set followed by a sudden physical collapse in the second or third, that's a more serious conversation worth watching closely. One data point is just one data point. A single lopsided set after an extraordinary 2-week stretch is exactly what you'd expect from ordinary physical exhaustion, the kind that resolves itself with proper rest and doesn't require any deeper concern. But patterns are different from single events, and if this exact shape shows up again in her very next tournament, a strong start, followed by an unexplained collapse in the back half of a match, that stops looking like a one-time toll from an unusually demanding stretch and starts looking like something that needs a much closer, more careful examination. That pattern, if it repeats, stops being a simple story about an exhausting 2 weeks and starts becoming a story about whether the schedule itself needs to change going forward, whether her team needs to be more deliberate about spacing out tournaments, building in mandatory rest windows, and resisting the temptation to chase every available opportunity just because the ranking points and the momentum are sitting right there. It could also become a story about whether more recovery time needs to be built into her training and travel schedule as a permanent structural change, not just a reactive one-off decision made after a bad loss, but an actual philosophy shift in how her career gets managed from this point forward. And in a small number of cases, repeated patterns like this can also point towards something physical that needs more direct medical attention, whether that's a specific muscle imbalance, an overuse issue building quietly in the background, or simply a conditioning gap that needs to be addressed before it becomes a recurring issue rather than a single, explainable moment tied to an extraordinary 2-week stretch. Right now, though, there's no evidence pointing toward that more concerning version of events. Nothing about Sunday's loss, viewed in isolation, suggests anything beyond straightforward physical exhaustion after an unusually demanding run. There's simply a young player who did more in 2 weeks than almost anyone else on tour was asking of themselves in that same stretch, competing at an elite level match after match, city after city, with barely any real days off in between, and then, for one set, her body finally said it couldn't do any more. That's not a red flag. That's closer to a natural, almost inevitable consequence of exactly the kind of run she'd been on. The real test isn't this loss. The real test is what her next tournament looks like, and whether this shows up again or gets left behind as a single, understandable moment in an otherwise historic month. So tell me, honestly, what you think about this. Do you think her team should have pulled her out of Toronto completely after Washington, protected her body, and accepted a shorter run in exchange for long-term health and freshness heading into the rest of the hard-court season? That's the cautious path, and it's not a hard case to make. It's built around the idea that careers in this sport are long, that a player can spend a decade or more at the highest level if things are managed correctly, and that bodies at 21 are still developing, still adapting to the physical demands of a full tour schedule in a way that older, more established veterans have already been through and adjusted to over many years. From that perspective, one missed opportunity for a deep run in Toronto is a genuinely small price to pay if it means avoiding an injury that could cost weeks, or in a worst-case scenario, months down the line. Plenty of coaches and sports physios would argue that exact case without hesitation, that protecting the body always comes first. Always, no exceptions, because trophies and rankings can always be chased again next month or next season, but recovery from a serious physical breakdown cannot always be rushed onto a convenient timeline. A stress fracture doesn't care how badly you want to compete next week. A soft tissue injury doesn't negotiate with a ranking deadline. Once the body actually breaks down in a serious way, the recovery clock runs on its own schedule, not the player's. And that's precisely the outcome the cautious path is designed to avoid at almost any cost. Or was pushing through exactly the right call, given how rare these opportunities actually are. This is the other side of the argument, and it's not a weak one either. Momentum in tennis doesn't wait for anyone, and it doesn't announce itself in advance. A player can go an entire season, sometimes multiple seasons, without ever feeling as sharp, as confident, or as genuinely dangerous as Eala clearly felt across these 2 weeks, moving well, striking the ball cleanly, believing in her own game against opponents who would have intimidated her a year earlier. There's a real argument that walking away from that feeling intentionally, even for the best and most well-intentioned reasons, means walking away from something that might not come back around again for months, or possibly even longer. Confidence like that is fragile and rare, and some players go their entire careers chasing a stretch that never quite arrives the way this one did for her. There's also the practical, less emotional side of this argument, the side built around ranking points, seeding implications, and tournament access for the rest of the season. Every match won in Toronto meant real points on the board, points that directly affect where she gets seeded in upcoming tournaments, which in turn affects who she has to face and how early she has to face them. Those are not small, abstract benefits. They shape an entire season's trajectory. And then there's the confidence dimension specifically tied to competition, not just general momentum, but the very concrete confidence that comes from beating a top 3 player in a title match and then immediately proving that result wasn't a fluke by backing it up again and again against increasingly difficult opponents in a completely different city and a completely different tournament. That kind of validation is hard to manufacture any other way. It doesn't come from practice sessions or exhibition matches. It only comes from live competition against players who are genuinely trying to beat you, and once it's earned, it tends to compound, showing up in body language, in shot selection under pressure, in the small margins that separate good players from great ones in the biggest moments. Momentum like that can shape an entire season, sometimes an entire career trajectory, and choosing to sit it out deliberately, even with the best long-term intentions, carries its own kind of risk. It's a different risk than the injury risk on the other side of this argument, but it's a real one nonetheless. The risk of never quite recapturing a feeling this good again, of wondering months later what might have happened if the run had been allowed to continue, instead of being cut short in the name of caution. There's a real argument on both sides of this, and I genuinely don't think there's an obviously correct answer here, which is exactly why I want to hear where you land on it. This isn't a case where one side is clearly right and the other is clearly reckless. It's a genuine trade-off between two competing priorities that both matter: long-term health against short-term opportunity, and different teams, different coaches, and different players would reasonably make different calls in this exact same situation. Drop your answer in the comments, because I think this is the kind of decision that actually separates good management from great management in tennis. The kind of call that doesn't get judged fairly in the moment, but often gets judged very clearly with hindsight, months or years later. Reasonable people can disagree about which path was the right one here, and I'd genuinely like to know which side of this you fall on. And stick around for how she responds in her next tournament, because that's the match that actually tells us whether Sunday was just fatigue catching up after an extraordinary 2 weeks, or something more that needs closer attention going forward. Either way, the answer to that question is coming soon, and it might end up telling us more about where this career is actually headed than either the Washington title or the Toronto run ever did on their own.